Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most terrifying dinner tables in history, where a single bite could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine being so powerful that you rule millions, yet so paranoid that you can't even trust a simple piece of bread. What if I told you that some of the most feared rulers in history were actually the most frightened people at their own dinner tables? And that there was one job in royal palaces that had a higher death rate than being a gladiator in ancient Rome. Tonight, we're diving into the deadly world of royal taste testers, where loyalty was measured in poison, and dinner was literally a matter of life and death. Now, before we step into these shadowy palace kitchens together, I'd love for you to join our late-night storytelling family. If these tales of power, paranoia, and palace intrigue speak to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you find yourself completely absorbed in tonight's story, a gentle like would mean the world to me. I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps with a cup of tea, or maybe you're taking a late-night walk? Drop a comment and let me know what draws you to these historical mysteries. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's unlock the secrets of the most dangerous dining rooms ever created. Picture this. It's 336 BC in ancient Macedonia. Alexander the Great, the man who would conquer most of the known world, sits before a feast that could feed a small army. Golden cups filled with wine, platters of roasted meats, exotic fruits from distant lands. But Alexander doesn't touch a single morsel. Instead, he watches intently as a young man, no older than 20, takes careful bites from each dish, sips from each cup, and then waits. They all wait 10 minutes, 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. Only when Alexander is satisfied that his taste tester shows no signs of distress, does the great conqueror finally begin to eat. This wasn't just paranoia. This was survival. Because in Alexander's world, poison was the weapon of choice for those who couldn't face you with a sword. And the taste tester, he was the human shield between a king and a very painful death. But here's what's truly fascinating. These taste testers weren't just random servants plucked from the kitchen. They were often young nobles, educated men who understood exactly what they were signing up for. They knew that every meal could be their last, yet they competed for the position. Why? Because surviving as a royal taste tester for just a few years could set your family up for generations. The pay was extraordinary, the prestige immense, and if you lived long enough, you might even be granted lands and titles. Take Mithridates, a taste tester for the Roman Emperor Claudius. Historical records show he sampled over 3,000 meals during his 5-year service. Think about that. 3,000 potential death sentences, and he survived them all. When he finally retired, he was given a villa outside Rome and enough gold to live like a king himself. But for every Mithridates, there were dozens of others whose names we'll never know, whose only legacy is a brief mention in palace records. Taster died during evening meal, replaced immediately. The methods these taste testers used were surprisingly sophisticated. They didn't just eat and hope for the best. Many developed an almost supernatural ability to detect the subtlest changes in taste, smell, and texture. They knew that bitter almonds meant cyanide, that a metallic aftertaste could indicate arsenic, and that certain plant-based poisons left a telltale burning sensation on the tongue. Some taste testers even developed partial immunity to certain poisons by consuming tiny, non-lethal doses over time, essentially poisoning themselves slowly to build resistance. It's a practice that sounds insane to us today, but for them, it was just another day at the office. But perhaps no ruler was more paranoid about food than Napoleon Bonaparte. After his rise to power, Napoleon employed not just one, but 3 different taste testers for every meal. They worked in shifts, and each had to sample the food at different intervals. The first tester would try the food immediately after preparation, the second after a 15-minute wait, and the third just before Napoleon ate. This wasn't just excessive caution. Napoleon had good reason to be afraid. During his campaigns, there were at least 7 documented attempts to poison him through his food. One of the most chilling occurred during his Italian campaign in 1796. His primary taste tester, a man named Francois, detected something wrong with Napoleon's morning coffee. The bitter taste was too pronounced, the color slightly off. Francois took a larger sip to be certain, and within minutes he was convulsing on the ground. He survived barely, but spent 3 days in agony as the poison, later identified as a mercury compound, worked its way out of his system. What's remarkable is that Francois returned to work the very next week. When asked why, he simply said, "The Emperor trusts me with his life. How could I abandon that trust?" This loyalty wasn't just admirable, it was essential. Because the relationship between a ruler and their taste tester was perhaps the most intimate bond in the entire palace. More than bodyguards, more than advisors, taste testers shared every meal, every drink, every moment of potential vulnerability with their masters. And the psychological toll was immense. Imagine sitting down to breakfast every morning knowing it might be your last. Historical accounts describe taste testers who developed elaborate rituals before eating. Prayers, lucky charms, specific sequences of tasting that they believed would protect them. Some became so anxious that they could barely sleep, constantly worried about the next meal. The irony is that many of these rulers, despite all their precautions, despite watching their taste testers suffer and sometimes die, often met their end through poison anyway. Because where there's absolute power, there's always someone plotting to take it away. And sometimes, the very people meant to protect the king were the ones who ultimately betrayed him. The technology of poison detection in royal courts was surprisingly advanced for its time. Some palaces employed what we might call the first food laboratories, rooms where taste testers could analyze suspicious foods using primitive but effective methods. They used silver utensils not just for their beauty, but because silver would tarnish when exposed to certain sulfur-based poisons. They kept caged birds near the dining area, because birds are more sensitive to airborne toxins and would show distress before humans. But perhaps the most ingenious method was the use of unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, which was believed to neutralize poison on contact. While this was pure superstition, the psychological effect was powerful. When a taste tester used a unicorn horn spoon and survived the meal, it reinforced everyone's belief in the protection it provided. As we drift deeper into this world of palace intrigue and deadly dining, you might be wondering about the families of these brave souls who risked everything for their royal masters. What happened to their wives and children when they didn't come home from work? How did entire dynasties of taste testers pass down their dangerous trade from father to son? And speaking of dangerous family traditions, wait until you hear about the bizarre dining rules that meant kings could never ever eat alone, not even for a simple breakfast. Because in our next chapter, we'll discover why royal meals became elaborate theatrical performances, where every bite was a statement of power, and where eating in private was considered more dangerous than eating in public. The reasons will absolutely astound you, and the consequences of breaking these rules were far more severe than you might imagine. The greatest irony of absolute power. The more powerful you became, the less alone time you were allowed to have. And nowhere was this more evident than at the dinner table. While taste testers were busy risking their lives with every bite, The kings and queens they served faced a different kind of torment. The complete and utter impossibility of enjoying a quiet meal. You see, for royalty, eating wasn't just about nourishment. It was theatre. It was politics. It was a carefully choreographed performance where every gesture was scrutinized, every bite was analyzed, and every moment of vulnerability was on full display. Let me paint you a picture of what breakfast looked like for Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. It's 7 a.m. at the Palace of Versailles, and Louis is about to eat a simple piece of bread and drink some chocolate. Sounds peaceful, right? Wrong. Before he can take his first bite, exactly 47 people must be present in the room. I'm not exaggerating. Court records from 1682 list the precise number and rank of every person required to witness the king's morning meal. There's the Grand Master of the Wardrobe, who must ensure the king's napkin is properly folded. A First Gentleman of the Bedchamber, whose job is to watch the king's facial expressions for any sign of discomfort. The Captain of the Guards, positioned exactly 12 feet from the table. Various nobles, diplomats, and courtiers, all standing in perfect formation, all watching the king chew his food. And here's the kicker: they weren't just watching. They were taking mental notes. Who did the king look at while eating? Did he nod approvingly at the bread, suggesting the baker was in good favor? Did he pause while drinking his chocolate, perhaps indicating displeasure with the supplier? Every micro-expression, every small gesture was analyzed and reported throughout the palace within hours. But why? Why subject yourself to this bizarre public dining ritual when you literally own everything and everyone around you? The answer lies in a psychological truth that still applies today. Power is only real if people believe it's real. And for medieval and Renaissance monarchs, there was no better way to demonstrate divine authority than to show that even the most basic human activities, like eating, were sacred events worthy of an audience. Think about it from their perspective. If you're claiming to be chosen by God to rule over millions of people, you can't just sneak into the kitchen at midnight for a sandwich like the rest of us. Every meal becomes a religious ceremony, a reminder to everyone present that they're witnessing something holy, something that separates you from ordinary mortals. Henry VIII of England took this concept to absolutely ridiculous extremes. Historical accounts from his court describe dinner ceremonies that lasted up to 4 hours, not because the food took that long to eat, but because the ritual of presenting each dish was so elaborate. Henry would sit at a raised table while over 200 courtiers stood in perfect silence, watching him eat course after course. But here's where it gets really interesting. Henry actually hated these public dining spectacles. Private letters written by his personal physician, discovered in the British archives in 1987, reveal that the king suffered from what we would now recognize as social anxiety around meals. He complained of feeling nauseous before large dinner ceremonies and often ate very little during public meals, preferring to have actual meals in private later. Yet he couldn't stop the tradition, because stopping would be seen as weakness. And for a king like Henry, who'd already broken with the Catholic Church and executed 2 wives, any sign of weakness could be fatal. The psychological pressure on these monarchs was immense. Imagine never being able to make a face at food you don't like, never being able to eat quickly when you're hungry, never being able to have a casual conversation over a meal. Every dinner was a performance review where failure could mean losing not just your crown, but your life. Catherine the Great of Russia understood this better than most. She once wrote in her diary, "I have not eaten a meal in solitude for over 30 years. Even my breakfast toast comes with an audience." But Catherine was clever. she turned the public dining requirement into a strategic advantage. She instituted what she called wisdom dinners, where the brightest minds in her empire were invited to dine with her. While she ate, they would present new ideas, debate philosophy, and discuss innovations. These dinners became legendary throughout Europe, not just for their intellectual content, but because Catherine proved that royal dining could be both public spectacle and practical governance. However, not every monarch was as resourceful as Catherine. Take poor King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known as the Mad King. Ludwig was so overwhelmed by the constant public attention during meals that he began holding elaborate dinner parties for himself. He would have his servants set a table for 12 people, prepare enough food for a dozen guests, and then eat alone while pretending to have conversations with imaginary dinner companions. Court records show that Ludwig would speak to empty chairs, toast invisible guests, and even argue with phantom dinner partners. His servants were required to respond as if the imaginary guests were real, creating dinner theater that was both tragic and surreal. This wasn't madness in the traditional sense. It was a desperate attempt to maintain the public dining tradition, while achieving some semblance of mental privacy. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of royal public dining was the mirror rule. This was an unwritten law in most European courts that required strategic placement of mirrors around the royal dining area. These weren't for vanity, they were surveillance tools. The mirrors allowed courtiers and guards to watch the monarch's face from multiple angles, ensuring that no expression or gesture went unnoticed. French court records from the 17th century describe how these mirrors were used to catch monarchs in unguarded moments. If a king looked displeased while eating food from a particular region, it could signal political displeasure with that area. If a queen smiled while eating a gift of exotic fruit from a foreign ambassador, it might indicate warming diplomatic relations. The pressure was so intense that many royals developed what court physicians called dining face, a completely neutral, emotionless expression that they maintained throughout meals. They trained themselves to show no reaction to anything they ate, turning their faces into masks that revealed nothing about their true thoughts or feelings. And the strangest part? This tradition of public dining actually made assassination attempts more likely, not less. Because while hundreds of people were watching the monarch eat, they were also creating perfect cover for potential poisoners among the servants, courtiers, and kitchen staff. The very system designed to protect through transparency actually created more opportunities for treachery. Which brings us to perhaps the most shocking discovery of all. The foods that were considered so dangerous, so politically explosive, that they could literally start wars if the wrong person was caught eating them. Because in our next chapter, we'll explore the forbidden foods that were deemed too risky for royal consumption, and the incredible reasons why a simple piece of garlic could topple an empire, or why chocolate was once considered so dangerous that queens were forbidden from eating it in public. The stories behind these food bans will challenge everything you think you know about royal power and privilege. Now here's where royal dining gets truly absurd. Imagine foods so politically dangerous that they could literally topple governments and start international conflicts. We're not talking about exotic delicacies or rare spices. We're talking about everyday foods that you probably have in your kitchen right now. Take garlic, for instance. This humble bulb that we use to flavor our pasta sauce was once considered the most subversive food in European royal courts. Why? Because garlic was peasant food. And for a monarch claiming divine right to rule, being caught eating peasant food was like admitting you were no different from the people you governed. But the story gets even more fascinating. In 1348, during the height of the Black Death, French court physicians recommended garlic as a remedy against the plague. The medical advice was sound. Garlic does have antibacterial properties. But King Philip VI faced an impossible choice: eat the garlic and potentially save his life, or maintain royal dignity and risk death from disease. Philip chose dignity. Historical records from the French royal archives show that he issued a formal decree stating that no person of noble blood shall consume the stinking rose, even as plague ravaged his kingdom. The irony: many of Philip's peasant subjects who freely ate garlic had better survival rates during the plague than the nobility who avoided it for social reasons. This wasn't just vanity, it was political survival. Because in the medieval mind, if a king ate like a peasant, what stopped him from being replaced by a peasant? The distinction between royal and common food wasn't just about taste. It was about maintaining the entire social order. And then there's chocolate. Today, we think of chocolate as the ultimate luxury, but in the 16th century Spanish court, it was considered so dangerous that Queen Isabella banned it outright for all royal women. The reason? Chocolate was believed to be an aphrodisiac that could drive women to uncontrollable passion. Spanish court records from 1580 describe a scandal where a young duchess was caught secretly drinking chocolate before an important state dinner. The punishment was exile from court for 6 months, not because she broke a minor dietary rule, but because she was seen as compromising her virtue, and, by extension, the moral authority of the crown. But here's the delicious irony. While Spanish royal women were forbidden from eating chocolate, Spanish royal men were encouraged to consume it before diplomatic meetings, because it was thought to enhance their mental clarity and negotiating power. This gender-based food discrimination became so notorious that it actually influenced international relations. Foreign ambassadors would sometimes bring chocolate gifts specifically for Spanish kings, knowing that presenting it to the Queen would be seen as an insult. The Portuguese took food prohibition to an even more extreme level. King Juan IV banned all members of his court from eating tomatoes. Now, you might think this was about poison. After all, tomatoes are part of the nightshade family. But no, the reason was purely economic and political. Tomatoes were first introduced to Europe from the Americas, and King Juan was engaged in a bitter trade war with Spanish colonies, where tomatoes were grown. Eating tomatoes, he declared, was equivalent to supporting enemy economics. Court records show that the penalty for being caught eating a tomato was a fine equivalent to 6 months' salary for a typical courtier. But the story gets better. Juan's own daughter, Princess Catherine, was caught growing tomatoes in her private garden. When confronted, she argued that she wasn't eating them. She was just studying their botanical properties. The king was so impressed by her cleverness that he actually modified the law to allow scientific observation of forbidden foods, creating the first known legal loophole for royal food curiosity. Perhaps no food caused more international drama than the potato. Yes, the humble potato was once considered so politically dangerous that Frederick the Great of Prussia had to use reverse psychology to get his people to eat it. Here's what happened. Frederick knew that potatoes could solve famine problems in his kingdom, but his nobles refused to eat them because potatoes grew underground. And according to biblical interpretation, anything that grew in darkness was considered unclean and inappropriate for God's chosen rulers, so Frederick declared potatoes a royal delicacy, available only to the nobility. He posted guards around his potato fields during the day, but secretly ordered them to abandon their posts at night. Curious peasants would sneak in to steal these royal potatoes, and slowly potato consumption spread throughout Prussia. It was perhaps the most successful food marketing campaign in history. Make something forbidden and exclusive, then let human nature take its course. But the most shocking food ban of all, beef. In medieval Ireland, eating beef was literally treason if you were of royal blood. The Irish Brehon laws, dating back to the 8th century, declared that cattle was so sacred and economically important that royal families could only eat them during specific religious ceremonies. King Brian Boru, the famous Irish king who defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, once broke this law during a feast celebrating a military victory. He ate beef publicly, arguing that his victory justified the celebration. The backlash was swift and severe. Several noble families withdrew their support, claiming he had violated sacred law. The incident weakened Brian's political position so significantly that historians now debate whether it contributed to the circumstances that led to his death. Just days after his greatest military triumph, one meal, one piece of forbidden beef, and the political landscape of medieval Ireland was forever changed. And here's perhaps the strangest part of all these food prohibitions. Many of them were secretly ignored by the very royals who enforced them. Private letters and diary entries discovered centuries later reveal that many monarchs had elaborate systems for secretly consuming forbidden foods. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, kept detailed records of her dietary transgressions. She regularly ate garlic, loved chocolate, and even grew her own tomatoes. But she was so skilled at maintaining her public image that none of her contemporaries ever suspected her secret food habits. She wrote in her private diary, "A queen must appear to live by different rules, even if privately she enjoys the same simple pleasures as her subjects. The crown is as much theatre as it is governance." This brings us to perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of royal food culture. What these impossible rules did to the youngest members of royal families. Because royal children weren't exempt from these bizarre dining laws. In fact, they were often subjected to even stricter food rules than adults, creating childhood experiences so strange and restrictive that they shaped entire personalities and, sometimes, the course of history itself. But the children's stories we're about to explore aren't just about what they couldn't eat. They're about the elaborate, almost ritualistic ways they were forced to consume their meals. Rules so complex and demanding that many royal children developed eating disorders, phobias, and behavioral patterns that lasted their entire lives. If you think the adults had it bad, wait until you hear what royal children endured. Because turning an innocent child into a future monarch required breaking down every natural instinct they had around food and rebuilding them according to rules so bizarre that modern child psychologists would be horrified. Let's start with little Louis XI, who became King of France at the tender age of 4. From that moment forward, every meal became a lesson in divine authority. But here's what's truly shocking. Louis wasn't allowed to feed himself until he was 8 years old. Not because he was incapable, but because royal children eating with their own hands was considered undignified. Instead, a specially trained courtier called the royal feeding master would place each bite into the young king's mouth using a golden spoon. Court records from 1642 show that this process took exactly 47 minutes. For a simple breakfast of bread and milk, the child had to sit perfectly still, hands folded, while an adult controlled every aspect of his eating experience. But that's not even the strangest part. Little Louis was required to taste 12 different foods at every meal, regardless of whether he wanted them or not. The reasoning? A future king needed to understand the full range of flavors in his kingdom. If he couldn't appreciate the taste of turnips, how could he govern the farmers who grew them? The psychological impact was devastating. Louis's personal tutor, in letters discovered in the French National Archives, described how the young king would sometimes cry silently during meals, not from hunger, but from the overwhelming pressure of performing royalty while still being a child. He wrote, "The boy king eats not as a child enjoys food, but as an actor performs a role he does not yet understand." And this wasn't unique to France. Across Europe, royal children were subjected to eating rituals that would seem like torture to modern parents. Take young Elizabeth Tudor, later to become Elizabeth I of England. Starting at age 6, she was required to recite a different Bible verse before eating each course of her meal. Court records show that her tutors maintained lists of appropriate verses for different foods, one for bread, another for meat, a third for vegetables. But here's where it gets really twisted. If Elizabeth forgot a verse or recited the wrong one, she wasn't allowed to eat that course. A 6-year-old child going hungry because she couldn't remember the correct biblical passage for her porridge. Her governess, Catherine Champernowne, wrote in her diary that young Elizabeth sometimes went to bed hungry 3 nights a week because of these religious dining requirements. The long-term effects were profound. As an adult, Elizabeth was known for her incredibly austere eating habits. She would often eat just 1 meal a day and was famous for her ability to fast for days during political negotiations. Historians now believe this wasn't discipline. It was childhood trauma expressing itself through food control. Russian royal children face perhaps the most elaborate dining ceremonies of all. In the court of Ivan the Terrible, children as young as 3 were required to participate in what were called training feasts, elaborate practice sessions where they learned proper royal dining behavior. These weren't casual lessons. They were formal ceremonies lasting up to 3 hours, where young children had to master incredibly complex protocols. For example, they had to know exactly how many seconds to pause between bites, 12 seconds for boys, 15 for girls. They had to learn specific ways to hold their utensils for different types of food. One grip for meat, another for vegetables, a third for bread. Most incredibly, they were required to eat in specific emotional states. Court manuscripts from the 16th century describe how children were taught to eat with joy when consuming foods from allied regions, and to eat with solemn respect when consuming foods associated with military victories. Imagine being 5 years old and having to regulate your emotional expression while eating a piece of bread because it came from a politically significant region. The training was so intense that many royal children developed what we would now recognize as eating disorders. Prince Alexei, son of Peter the Great, became so anxious around food that he would vomit before formal meals. Court physicians of the time didn't understand this as psychological trauma. They thought he was being poisoned and subjected him to even more elaborate food testing procedures, which only made his anxiety worse. But perhaps the most heartbreaking example comes from the Chinese imperial court. Young princes and princesses were subjected to something called the harmony of flavors ritual, where they had to eat foods in specific combinations that represented political alliances. If the emperor was negotiating with a neighboring kingdom, the children might be required to eat rice, representing their own empire, mixed with specific spices representing the other kingdom, and they had to eat these combinations with perfect composure, even if the flavors were terrible. Court records from the Ming dynasty describe children as young as 4 being forced to eat combinations like bitter melon with sweet fruit, or salty fish with honey, all while maintaining royal dignity. The rationale was that future rulers needed to understand that sometimes you have to accept unpleasant things for the good of the state. But the reality was traumatizing. Many of these children grew up with severe food aversions and complicated relationships with eating that lasted their entire lives. And here's what's most disturbing. These children weren't just learning to eat. They were learning to suppress their natural human responses. They couldn't make faces at bad-tasting food, couldn't express preferences, couldn't even eat when they were hungry if it wasn't the designated mealtime. Young Mary, Queen of Scots, raised in the French court, was forbidden from asking for food between meals. Court etiquette demanded that royal children wait for food to be offered, never request it. If she was hungry at 2 p.m. but dinner wasn't until 6 p.m., she simply had to endure the hunger in silence. Her letters to her mother, discovered in Scottish archives, describe the constant gnawing sensation of being hungry, but not being allowed to express that need. The psychological manipulation was incredible. These children were taught that their basic human needs, hunger, taste preferences, even the simple pleasure of enjoying food, was secondary to their royal obligations. They learned to disconnect from their own bodies, to treat physical sensations as less important than political appearances. Some children rebelled in creative ways. Catherine de' Medici, when she was young, developed an elaborate secret code with her personal servant. She would touch different parts of her face during meals to indicate which food she actually liked or disliked, creating a private language of food preferences that the court couldn't monitor. But for every child who found ways to maintain some autonomy, there were many more who simply accepted the dehumanizing aspects of royal dining. They learned to eat without tasting, to sit without fidgeting, to perform hunger and satisfaction on command. The saddest part? Many of these children, when they became adults, perpetuated the same cruel traditions with their own children, not because they believed in them, but because they had never learned any other way to be royal. The trauma became tradition, passed down through generations of European nobility, which brings us to an even darker chapter in royal dining history. Because these carefully trained royal children, with their perfect dining etiquette and political food knowledge, eventually grew up to navigate the most dangerous aspect of royal life: diplomatic dinner parties, where a single mistake in food protocol could literally start wars, end alliances, and topple empires. The stories of these diplomatic dining disasters are so outrageous, so filled with international intrigue and life-or-death stakes, that they read like the most dramatic spy novels ever written. All that careful training in royal dining etiquette, it was preparation for the most dangerous dinner parties in human history. Diplomatic feasts where one wrong move could literally rewrite the map of Europe. Picture this. It's 1520, and two of the most powerful men in the world are about to sit down for dinner. King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France are meeting at an event that history would later call the Field of Cloth of Gold. This wasn't just a meal, it was a 3-week festival designed to prevent a war. And yet, a single seating arrangement nearly triggered the very conflict they were trying to avoid. Here's what went wrong. Henry's protocol master made a seemingly innocent decision. He seated the English nobles on the right side of the high table, the traditional place of honor, and the French nobles on the left. But here's the problem. In French court tradition, the left side was actually the place of honor. The French delegation interpreted this as a deliberate insult, suggesting that England considered itself superior to France. The tension was immediate and electric. French nobles began standing during the meal, a clear sign of disrespect. English courtiers responded by adjusting their positions to look down on the standing French. Within minutes, what was supposed to be a peace dinner had become a cold war fought with body language and dining positions. Francis I himself was so offended that he ordered his entire retinue to eat standing for the remainder of the feast, turning the entire dinner into a bizarre standoff where one side sat and the other stood, all while trying to maintain diplomatic smiles and negotiate peace treaties. The incident was so serious that it took 3 days of behind-the-scenes negotiation just to arrange the next meal. And here's the kicker. Historians now believe that this dining debacle contributed to Henry's decision to ally with Charles V of Spain against France just 2 years later. A seating chart literally helped reshape European alliances. But the French were masters of food diplomacy themselves, sometimes using it with devastating effectiveness. In 1659, Cardinal Mazarin hosted a dinner for Spanish ambassadors during peace negotiations to end the Franco-Spanish War. Everything seemed perfect until the dessert course. Mazarin had ordered his chefs to create sugar sculptures representing various European cities. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. The sugar sculpture of Madrid, Spain's capital, was deliberately made smaller than the one representing Paris. Worse, it was placed at the far end of the table, symbolically distant from the place of honor. The Spanish ambassador, Diego de Saavedra, immediately understood the insult. In his diary, later discovered in Spanish archives, he wrote, "The French have made their position clear. They see Madrid as a distant secondary city compared to their Paris. This sugar speaks louder than any treaty negotiation." Saavedra stood up, walked to the Madrid sculpture, and deliberately knocked it over with his hand. Then he calmly returned to his seat and continued eating as if nothing had happened. The gesture was so shocking that the entire room fell silent. Mazarin, to his credit, simply ordered the servants to bring out new desserts, without any city sculptures. But the damage was done. Negotiations stalled for 6 months because of that sugar sculpture incident. What should have been a simple peace treaty signing turned into an extended diplomatic crisis, all because someone thought it was clever to rank European capitals by dessert size. The Chinese took food diplomacy to an even more sophisticated level. During the Ming Dynasty, imperial banquets weren't just about eating. They were elaborate intelligence operations disguised as dinner parties. Consider the famous Jade Harmony Banquet of 1582, hosted by Emperor Wanli for visiting Japanese envoys. Every single dish served contained a hidden message about Chinese military capabilities and political intentions. The number of courses indicated how many provinces China was prepared to defend. The types of meat suggested which animals the Chinese military used for transportation. Even the arrangement of vegetables on each plate followed patterns that corresponded to Chinese troop formations. The Japanese envoys, who were also trained in the symbolic language, understood immediately that they were being shown China's complete military readiness. The dinner was essentially a peaceful way of saying, "We're prepared for war, but we'd prefer to negotiate." But sometimes cultural differences in food diplomacy led to hilarious misunderstandings with serious consequences. In 1683, a Russian delegation visited the court of Louis XIV in France. The Russians, following their own customs, brought their own food to the French feast, a gesture meant to show self-sufficiency and respect. The French, however, interpreted this as a massive insult, suggesting that French food wasn't good enough for Russian palates. The situation escalated when the Russian ambassador Peter Tolstoy began eating from his own supplies while sitting at Louis's table. To the French court, this was the equivalent of spitting in the king's face. Louis XIV was so offended that he stood up and left his own dinner party, something that had never happened before in the history of Versailles. The Russian delegation was expelled from France within 48 hours, and diplomatic relations between the two countries remained frozen for over a decade. But here's the twisted part. The Russians had no idea they had caused offense. In their culture, bringing your own food to a feast was considered the highest compliment. It meant you wanted to share your own delicacies with your hosts. Two cultures, Two completely different interpretations of the same gesture, and the result was years of international tension. The Ottoman Empire perfected perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated food diplomacy of all. They used something called the Sultan's silence. Strategic moments during diplomatic dinners when the Sultan would simply stop eating and stare at his guests. During a 1663 negotiation with Austrian ambassadors, Sultan Mehmed IV employed this technique with devastating effect. Halfway through the meal, he put down his utensils and fixed his gaze on the Austrian delegation. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared while everyone else sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The Austrians began offering concessions just to break the tension. Within 20 minutes of absolute silence, they had agreed to territorial concessions that their government had previously deemed unacceptable. The Sultan never said a word during this entire negotiation. He conducted international diplomacy through the simple act of not eating. Perhaps the most bizarre diplomatic dining disaster occurred in 1598 between England and Spain. Philip II of Spain sent a delegation to Elizabeth's court with a very specific request. They wanted to negotiate while eating Spanish food, cooked by Spanish chefs, served on Spanish plates. Elizabeth agreed, thinking it was a gesture of cultural sharing. But here's what she didn't know. Spanish protocol required that any foreign leader who ate Spanish food prepared by Spanish hands was symbolically acknowledging Spanish superiority. When Elizabeth ate the Spanish meal, she was unknowingly participating in a ritual that, in Spanish law, made her a vassal of the Spanish crown. Philip II immediately sent letters to other European courts claiming that England had submitted to Spanish authority through this dinner. Elizabeth was furious when she learned about the symbolic meaning. She responded by hosting a return dinner where she served the Spanish delegation English food, prepared by English chefs on English plates, but with one addition. Every dish was seasoned with salt that had been blessed by English Protestant clergy, making it religiously unacceptable for the Catholic Spanish to consume. The Spanish delegation faced an impossible choice: eat the religiously prohibited food and violate their faith, or refuse to eat and insult their English hosts. They chose to eat nothing, sitting through a 7-course meal without taking a single bite. It was the most passive-aggressive dinner party in diplomatic history. But what happened when these diplomatic dining rules became so complex, so politically charged, that even the queens themselves couldn't navigate them safely? When royal women gained enough power to control not just their own diets, but the eating habits of entire nations. The stories we're about to explore reveal how female monarchs weaponized food on a scale that would make modern dictators jealous, using famine, feast, and everything in between to reshape entire civilizations according to their will. When you think absolute power, you probably imagine armies and castles. But the most terrifying queens in history knew something that kings often missed. Control the food supply, and you control everything. And some of these royal women wielded their dietary authority with a ruthlessness that would make modern dictators seem like amateur meal planners. Let's begin with Catherine the Great of Russia, who orchestrated what historians now call the Great Potato Conspiracy of 1762. When Catherine took power, Russia was facing regular famines that killed thousands every year. She knew potatoes could solve this problem. They were nutritious, hardy, and could grow in Russia's harsh climate. But her subjects refused to eat them. Why? Russian Orthodox priests had declared potatoes devil's apples because they grew underground, in darkness, which they associated with hell. The people would literally rather starve than eat what they considered satanic vegetables. So Catherine devised one of the most brilliant psychological operations in history. She declared that potatoes were now a royal delicacy, available only to the nobility. She planted vast potato fields around her palace and posted guards to protect them during the day, but secretly ordered the guards to disappear at night. Curious peasants, thinking they were stealing precious royal food, began sneaking into the fields to harvest potatoes. Within 3 years, potato cultivation had spread across Russia, not because Catherine forced her people to eat them, but because she made them think they were stealing forbidden royal treats. The result? Catherine's potato conspiracy prevented an estimated 100,000 deaths from famine over the next decade. But here's the darker side. She never told her people the truth. For the rest of her reign, Russians believed they were eating stolen royal food, which made Catherine seem even more powerful and mysterious. But Catherine's food manipulation was gentle compared to Rusetian, the only woman to rule China as emperor in her own right. In 683 AD, Wu issued what she called the Harmony Edict, a law that required every family in China to eat the same meal at the same time once per week. This wasn't about nutrition. This was about control. Wu realized that if she could synchronize the eating habits of 50 million people, she could demonstrate a level of authority that no previous ruler had achieved. Government officials would travel throughout the empire, announcing the weekly meal through drums and bells. On the designated day, from the poorest farmer to the richest merchant, everyone in China would eat the same simple rice and vegetable dish at exactly the same moment. Chinese historical records describe this as deeply unsettling for the population. People would look around their neighborhoods during these meals, seeing everyone eating identical food, and realize that their personal choices, even something as basic as what to eat for dinner, could be controlled by their empress. Wu maintained this practice for 12 years. Modern historians estimate that she successfully synchronized the eating habits of the largest population in human history at that time. It was a demonstration of power so absolute that it bordered on the supernatural in the minds of her subjects. But perhaps no queen used food control more ruthlessly than Isabella of Castile. In 1480, she issued the purity laws, religious dietary restrictions that were supposedly about faith, but were actually about ethnic cleansing. Isabella banned all Spanish Christians from eating certain foods associated with Jewish and Muslim populations. No lamb prepared in specific ways, no spices commonly used in Muslim cooking, no bread baked according to Jewish traditions. The penalty for violating these laws? Death. But here's the truly diabolical part. Isabella's spies would monitor markets and homes, looking for people who seemed to be avoiding these forbidden foods too carefully. If you followed the restrictions too perfectly, it suggested you were a converted Jew or Muslim still secretly practicing your original faith. Spanish Inquisition records preserved in the archive of the Crown of Aragon show that over 3,000 people were executed during Isabella's reign for food crimes. Some were killed for eating forbidden foods, others for not eating them in the right way. Isabella had created a system where the simple act of eating could be evidence of treason. The psychological terror was extraordinary. Families would gather for meals not knowing whether their food choices would lead to their death. Parents would teach their children elaborate performances round eating, how to show appropriate enthusiasm for certain dishes, how to demonstrate proper Christian disgust for others. Marie Antoinette took food control in a completely different direction. She tried to use luxury food to manipulate public opinion, with catastrophic results. During the bread shortage of 1788, when ordinary French people were starving, Marie Antoinette ordered the palace kitchens to create elaborate public displays of food abundance. She held outdoor banquets in the gardens of Versailles, where courtiers would feast on elaborate pastries and exotic delicacies, while crowds of hungry Parisians watched from outside the palace gates. Her reasoning? She believed that seeing the royal family eat well would reassure the people that the monarchy was strong and stable. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of feeling reassured, the starving crowds were enraged by the contrast between royal abundance and their own hunger. Eyewitness accounts from the French National Archives describe how these public feasts became riots, with crowds throwing stones at the palace walls while screaming about the Queen's extravagance. But Marie Antoinette doubled down. She ordered her chefs to create even more elaborate public displays, including a famous incident where she had a 12-foot-tall cake, shaped like the Palace of Versailles, carried through the streets of Paris. The message was supposed to be, "Look how magnificent your royal family is." But the starving population heard it as, "Look how little we care about your suffering." The historians now point to these food displays as one of the direct causes of the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's attempt to use luxury food as propaganda literally helped trigger the violent overthrow of the monarchy. Elizabeth I of England pioneered a more subtle but equally effective form of food control. She created what she called loyalty meals, mandatory feast days when all English subjects had to eat specific foods that demonstrated their allegiance to the crown. On the anniversary of her coronation, every English household had to serve roast beef, representing English strength. On the anniversary of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, everyone had to eat fish, representing English naval power. These weren't suggestions. They were royal commands enforced by local officials. English parish records from the 1590s show that families who couldn't afford the required foods would borrow money, sell possessions, or go into debt rather than risk being seen as disloyal. Elizabeth had turned eating into a patriotic duty, but also an economic burden that kept her subjects financially dependent on the crown. The most shocking aspect of all these Queen's food policies, they worked. These women understood something that male rulers often missed. Food is the most intimate form of control possible. When you control what people eat, when they eat it, and how they think about it, you don't just control their bodies, you control their minds. But controlling an entire nation's diet was just the beginning. Because these powerful queens also developed ways to communicate in secret, using the very dining process itself as a form of encrypted messaging. The codes they created with silverware, plate arrangements, and eating gestures were so sophisticated that they could conduct entire conversations, plan assassinations, and coordinate military operations, all while appearing to simply enjoy a peaceful meal. The secret language of royal dining that we're about to explore was more complex than any written code, more dangerous than any spoken conspiracy, and more powerful than any army. Because when your dinner fork could literally save or end a life, every meal became an exercise in espionage. What if I told you that throughout history the deadliest conversations never involved a single spoken word? That across the grand dining halls of Europe, Asia, and beyond, entire conspiracies were planned, lives were saved or condemned, and empires rose and fell, all through the seemingly innocent arrangement of dinner forks and wine glasses. Welcome to the secret world of royal silverware linguistics, where a knife placed at the wrong angle could start a war, and where knowing how to read a dinner table could literally mean the difference between life and death. Let's start with perhaps the most sophisticated example, the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. French royal dining had evolved into what historians now call the Silent Symphony, a complex communication system using silverware that was more intricate than modern computer code. Here's how it worked. If a courtier placed their knife parallel to their plate with the blade facing inward, it meant, I agree with the current political discussion. Blade facing outward meant, I disagree. But crossing the knife over the fork meant, I have urgent information to share privately. And if someone placed their knife perpendicular to their plate with the handle pointing toward another person, that was essentially pointing a finger. It meant, you are in danger. Court records from 1682, preserved in the French National Archives, describe a dinner where the Duke of Monmouth, King Charles II's illegitimate son, was visiting Versailles. During the meal, 3 different French nobles simultaneously arranged their silverware in the danger position, all pointing toward Monmouth. The Duke, trained in this silent language, immediately understood that there was a plot against his life. He excused himself from dinner, claiming illness, and fled back to England that very night. French intelligence records discovered centuries later revealed that there had indeed been a plan to poison Monmouth's wine during dessert. The silverware warning saved his life, but the French system was child's play compared to what the Japanese imperial court developed during the Heian period. They created what they called chopstick poetry, a method of communication so subtle and sophisticated that it took years to master. The way you held your chopsticks could indicate your emotional state. Holding them near the top meant happiness, near the middle meant neutrality, near the bottom meant sadness or distress. But it went much deeper than that. The angle at which you placed them on your rice bowl could communicate complex political positions. In 1185, during a crucial dinner between rival samurai clans, Lady Masako used chopstick poetry to coordinate what would become the Kamakura Revolution. Throughout the meal, she subtly adjusted her chopstick positions, sending signals to allies about timing, targets, and battle plans. The entire military strategy for overthrowing the existing government was communicated through dinner etiquette. What's remarkable is that the opposing clan leaders were sitting at the same table, watching Lady Masako eat, completely unaware that she was orchestrating their downfall with every movement of her utensils. The revolution succeeded partly because of the intelligence coordination that happened during that single meal. The Ottoman Empire developed perhaps the most practical silverware communication system. They called it the Sultan's Grammar, and it was primarily used for communicating during diplomatic dinners, when interpreters might be spies. Turkish court manuals from the 16th century, housed in the Topkapi Palace archives, detail over 200 different silverware signals. For example, if the Sultan touched his spoon to his lips 3 times before eating, it meant, I am considering this proposal favorably. If he stirred his food clockwise, it meant yes, counterclockwise meant no. But the most ingenious signal was what they called the mirror move. If the Sultan exactly mimicked another person's silverware movements, it meant, I want to continue this conversation privately after dinner. During a 1566 negotiation with the Venetian ambassadors, Sultan Suleiman used this technique to signal his interest in a secret trade agreement that couldn't be discussed openly. The Venetian ambassador, Marcantonio Barbaro, understood the signal and stayed behind after the formal dinner ended. They negotiated a secret spice trade monopoly that gave Venice exclusive access to certain Ottoman markets for over 50 years, all because of a mirrored fork movement during dessert. But silverware communication could also be weaponized in devastating ways. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born Queen of France, was notorious for using dinner signals to coordinate assassinations. She developed a system where the placement of wine glasses could indicate which guests were marked for elimination. A glass placed to the right of the plate meant this person leaves alive. A glass placed to the left meant this person does not leave alive. A glass placed behind the plate meant this person should suffer an accident within the week. French court records describe a 1572 dinner party where Catherine systematically arranged wine glasses for over 30 guests. Within 10 days, 15 of those guests, all of whom had their glasses placed to the left or behind their plates, had died under mysterious circumstances. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, one of the bloodiest episodes in French history, was partially coordinated through Catherine's dinner table death signals. The English court developed a more subtle but equally effective system focused on napkin folding. Elizabeth III's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, created what he called linen intelligence, a method of folding napkins that could communicate complex information about foreign agents, domestic threats, and military strategies. A napkin folded into a simple triangle meant all is well. Folded into a square meant mild concern. But a napkin twisted into a rope-like shape meant immediate danger. Evacuate the premises. During a 1586 dinner with suspected Catholic conspirators, Elizabeth herself used napkin signals to coordinate the arrest of the Babington plot conspirators who were planning to assassinate her. The most incredible aspect of these silverware languages was their sophistication. Some courts had different dialects for different types of meals. Breakfast silverware signals were different from dinner signals. Formal state banquets had their own specialized vocabulary that was distinct from intimate family dinners. Royal children were taught these communication methods from an early age, often before they could properly read or write in their native languages. Court records from various European palaces describe silverware schools, where young nobles learned to communicate through utensil placement, with the same intensity that modern children learn mathematics. And here's what's truly remarkable. These systems were so effective that some survived for centuries. The Habsburg court was still using modified versions of silverware communication well into the 18th century. Russian aristocracy maintained elements of table grammar until the 1917 revolution. But the most dangerous aspect of these silent languages was what happened when they were misunderstood. In 1648, during peace negotiations to end the 30 Years' War, a Swedish diplomat incorrectly interpreted a German prince's fork placement as a sign of agreement to territorial concessions. The Swedes proceeded with treaty discussions based on this misunderstanding, only to discover later that the German had actually been signaling disagreement. The confusion delayed peace negotiations by 6 months and led to thousands more deaths as the war continued. And sometimes the silverware signals were deliberately misinterpreted to justify predetermined actions. In 1688, James II of England claimed that certain nobles had used dinner table signals to coordinate against him. Whether this was true or not, James used these alleged silverware conspiracies as justification for arresting several political opponents. The paranoia around dinner table communication became so intense that some courts eventually banned certain silverware arrangements altogether. Specific fork angles were outlawed, certain knife positions were considered treasonous, and some napkin folds were literally illegal. But what happened when even these sophisticated communication systems weren't enough? When royal paranoia reached such heights that normal dining became impossible, forcing monarchs to implement eating rules so extreme, so bizarre, that they defied all logic and human nature. The midnight food laws were about to explore pushed royal dining restrictions into the realm of absolute madness, creating eating schedules so twisted that they challenged the very concept of human dignity. Imagine being so powerful that you could control when an entire kingdom ate dinner. Now imagine being so paranoid that you made laws requiring people to wake up at 3 a.m. for mandatory meals. Welcome to the twisted world of midnight food laws. Regulations so bizarre that they shocked even the kings who created them. Let's start with Louis XI of France, a king so obsessed with control that he regulated his subjects' eating schedules down to the minute. In 1461, Louis issued what he called the Sunset Decree, a law that forbade anyone in his kingdom from eating solid food after sunset. This wasn't about health or religious observance. This was about fear. Louis believed that people who ate in darkness were more likely to plot against him. His reasoning? In the shadows of evening meals, conspiracies are born with every bite. French royal archives contain detailed enforcement records of this law. Local officials were required to patrol neighborhoods every evening, checking homes for signs of illegal eating. The penalty for violating the Sunset Decree? 3 days in prison for the first offense, permanent exile for the second. But here's where it gets truly absurd. Louis made one exception to his own law. Royal family members were required to eat a security meal at exactly midnight every night. The logic was twisted but revealing. If the royal family was eating at midnight, they couldn't be sleeping, which meant they couldn't be surprised by nighttime attacks. Court records describe these midnight meals as surreal affairs. The entire royal family would gather in complete silence at the stroke of 12, eating cold meats and bread by candlelight while guards stood watch. No conversation was permitted. Louis believed that talking during midnight meals made participants vulnerable to supernatural influence. The psychological toll on the royal family was severe. Louis's own daughter, Princess Anne, wrote in her diary, "I have not slept a full night in 3 years. The midnight eating has made me feel like a ghost haunting my own life." But Louis's midnight obsession was nothing compared to Emperor Justinian of Byzantium, who created what historians call the most psychologically sophisticated eating schedule in royal history. Justinian believed that imperial power needed to be synchronized with celestial movements, so he designed his eating schedule around astronomical events. Byzantine court records from 527 AD describe Justinian's divine dining calendar. The emperor would eat his main meal at different times each day, calculated according to the position of stars and planets. Sometimes dinner was at 2 a.m., sometimes at 4 p.m. Sometimes he wouldn't eat for 18 hours straight if the stars weren't properly aligned. But here's the truly insane part. Justinian required his entire court to follow the same schedule. Over 300 courtiers, servants, and officials had to adjust their eating times daily, according to astronomical calculations performed by the imperial astrologers. Palace records describe the chaos this created. Servants would sometimes prepare elaborate feasts at 3 a.m., only to be told that planetary movements had shifted and the meal needed to be delayed until dawn. Kitchen staff worked in rotating shifts around the clock, never knowing when they'd be called to prepare an emergency imperial meal. The human cost was devastating. Court physician records, preserved in the Marciana Library in Venice, document that over 40% of palace staff suffered from what we would now recognize as severe insomnia and eating disorders. Some courtiers began secretly eating on normal schedules and pretending to follow the imperial timetable, risking execution if discovered. Henry VI of England took midnight food laws in a completely different direction. In 1445, he implemented what he called sacred fasting nights, mandatory periods when no one in England was allowed to eat between sunset and sunrise. But here's the twist. These fasting nights were declared randomly, sometimes with only hours of notice. Henry's messengers would ride throughout the kingdom, announcing that tonight, the realm fasts in service to God. Anyone caught eating during a declared fasting night faced charges of blasphemy. English parish records show that these random fasting declarations occurred 127 times during Henry's reign, sometimes 3 nights in a row, sometimes with months between declarations. The unpredictability was intentional. Henry believed that uncertainty about when they could eat would keep his subjects in a constant state of religious fear and political submission. The economic impact was catastrophic. Innkeepers never knew when they'd be forced to stop serving food. Families couldn't plan meals. The fishing industry collapsed because fishermen couldn't eat during night shifts if a fasting decree was suddenly announced. But perhaps the most psychologically cruel midnight food law came from Ivan the Terrible of Russia. In 1570, Ivan implemented the loyalty testing meals, a system where suspected traitors were forced to eat specific foods at 3 a.m. while Ivan watched. Here's how it worked. If Ivan suspected someone of disloyalty, he would summon them to the palace at 3 a.m. for a midnight meal of truth. The suspect would be presented with foods that had symbolic meanings. Black bread represented confession of guilt, white bread represented claims of innocence, and meat represented willingness to die for the Tsar. Russian court chronicles describe these sessions as psychological torture. The accused would sit in a dimly lit room while Ivan stared at them, trying to divine their loyalty based on how they ate. If they ate too quickly, it suggested nervousness and possible guilt. If they ate too slowly, it suggested they were stalling to think of lies. The most chilling aspect: Ivan would often already know whether the person was guilty or innocent before the meal began. The midnight eating session was pure theater, a way to psychologically break his victims before executing them. Court records show that of 78 people subjected to these midnight loyalty meals, 71 were executed within a week regardless of how they performed. Some rulers used midnight food laws to demonstrate religious devotion in the most extreme ways possible. The Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, bi Amr Allah, who ruled Egypt from 996 to 1021, created eating schedules that he claimed were directly inspired by divine revelation. Al-Hakim declared that true believers should eat only during specific hours that corresponded to prayer times, but he complicated this by claiming that Allah had revealed to him different eating schedules for different social classes. Nobles could eat during certain hours, merchants during others, and peasants during completely different times. The result was a society where your social status determined when you were legally allowed to eat. Historical records from the Cairo Geniza describe the surreal sight of Egyptian cities, where different groups of people would be eating at different times throughout the day, like a society-wide version of musical chairs played with meals. But the enforcement was brutal. Al-Hakim's religious police would patrol markets and homes, arresting anyone eating outside their designated hours. The penalty for temporal eating violations was public flogging for the first offense, exile for the second. The Chinese imperial court developed perhaps the most sophisticated midnight eating regulations, based on traditional medicine and Confucian philosophy. During the Tang dynasty, emperors followed eating schedules designed to maintain harmony between their bodies and the cosmic order. Chinese court medical records describe how the emperor's eating times were calculated according to the 5-element theory: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each element corresponded to different times of day, different seasons, and different types of food. Eating the wrong food at the wrong time was believed to disrupt not just the emperor's health, but the stability of the entire empire. Emperor Xuanzong, 712–756 AD, took this to extremes, requiring that all imperial meals be served at times calculated by court mathematicians, according to complex formulas involving lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and the emperor's personal astrological chart. Palace records show that Xuanzong sometimes went days without eating, because the calculations indicated that no time was cosmically appropriate for imperial dining. During one documented period in 743 AD, he fasted for 6 consecutive days, because court astronomers determined that planetary alignments made all eating times inauspicious for the Son of Heaven. The irony of all these midnight food laws? They often made the rulers who created them more vulnerable, not less. Predictable eating schedules gave assassins clear windows of opportunity. Random eating times created chaos that conspirators could exploit. And the psychological stress of maintaining these bizarre schedules often drove rulers to make poor political decisions. But even these midnight food laws pale in comparison to what happened when royal eating violations moved beyond schedule restrictions into the realm of physical punishment. Because when monarchs decided that breaking dining etiquette deserved the same penalties as treason, the consequences became so severe that some nobles spent decades eating standing up, using only their non-dominant hands, or following dining restrictions so humiliating that they defined the rest of their lives. There's something uniquely cruel about punishing someone through the basic act of eating. And in royal courts, violating dining etiquette could result in sentences so humiliating, so physically punishing, that many nobles chose exile over enduring them. Some punishments lasted decades, entire lifetimes spent eating in ways designed to break both body and spirit. Consider the case of Charles Blount, the Earl of Devonshire, who in 1601 made what seemed like a minor mistake during a dinner with Queen Elizabeth III. He reached for his wine glass with his left hand, a violation of court etiquette that indicated disrespect to the crown. Elizabeth's response was swift and merciless. She sentenced Blount to eat all future meals in the manner of penitence for the remainder of his time at court. What did this mean? For the next 4 years until Elizabeth's death, Blount was required to eat every meal standing up, using only his left hand while facing away from all other diners. English court records from the Hatfield House archives detail the psychological toll this took on Blount. He lost significant weight because eating with his non-dominant hand while standing made meals incredibly difficult and time-consuming. Worse, the social isolation was devastating. He became known as the backwoods Earl because he always faced away from others during meals. But Blount's punishment was considered mild compared to what happened to Don Carlos, son of Philip Thickers of Spain, in 1568 after Carlos laughed during a formal dinner, which was considered a grave breach of royal dignity. His father sentenced him to 20 years of silent eating. Spanish court documents describe this punishment in chilling detail. Don Carlos was forbidden from making any sound while eating for 2 decades. No chewing noises, no swallowing sounds, no requests for food or drink. He had to eat so carefully and quietly that other diners wouldn't even know he was consuming food. The physical techniques required to eat silently were exhausting. Carlos had to chew with his mouth in specific positions, swallow using throat muscles in ways that suppressed sound, and time his breathing to mask any digestive noises. Court physicians noted that he developed chronic jaw pain and digestive problems from the unnatural eating methods. But the psychological impact was worse. Carlos became so afraid of making noise while eating that he developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety around food. He would sometimes take over an hour to eat a simple piece of bread, carefully controlling every sound his body made. The French court developed perhaps the most elaborate system of eating punishments. Louis XIV created a hierarchy of dining humiliations that corresponded to different levels of court offenses. For minor violations like using the wrong fork or speaking out of turn, Offenders faced position punishment. They had to eat standing for 1 month. For moderate offenses like arriving late to dinner or wearing inappropriate clothing, the punishment was hand restriction. Violators could only eat with their non-dominant hand for 6 months. But for serious violations like contradicting the king or showing disrespect to royal family members, the punishment was the full dishonor. This required the offender to eat all meals standing, using only their left hand, facing away from other diners, and wearing a special grey cloth that marked them as being in food disgrace. French court records from 1683 document the case of the Marquis de Maintenon, who was sentenced to full dishonor for 3 years after he criticized the Queen's choice of dinner entertainment. The physical and social consequences nearly destroyed him. Maintenon's letters to his wife, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, described the ordeal. "I am become a ghost at my own table. My arm aches constantly from the unnatural eating position. I have lost the companionship of dining, which I never realized was so essential to human happiness. Food has become a daily reminder of my shame rather than a source of nourishment." But perhaps the most psychologically cruel punishment was developed by Catherine de' Medici. She created what she called flavor blindness, a sentence that required offenders to eat all their food completely unseasoned for a predetermined period. This might sound like a minor inconvenience, but Catherine understood the psychological power of flavor. Food without any seasoning, no salt, no pepper, no herbs, no spices, becomes a colorless, joyless experience. It transforms eating from a pleasure into pure biological necessity. Court records describe nobles who were sentenced to months or even years of flavorless eating. Many reported that they lost all interest in food, eating mechanically just to survive. Some developed what we might now recognize as depression, finding that the absence of taste pleasure affected their overall mood and mental state. The Duke of Guise, sentenced to 2 years of flavor blindness for insulting Catherine's Italian heritage, wrote in his diary, "Without taste, food becomes mere fuel. Without the pleasure of flavor, I find little pleasure in anything. This punishment reaches into parts of my soul I did not know existed." Russian courts took physical eating punishments to even more extreme levels. Ivan the Terrible created a punishment called beast eating for nobles who displeased him. Offenders were required to eat all their meals on the floor without utensils, using only their hands and mouth like animals. Russian chronicle records describe boyars, high-ranking nobles, crawling on the ground to eat from bowls placed on the floor while Ivan and his court watched. The humiliation was so complete that many nobles preferred exile or even death to enduring beast-eating. But Ivan added a twisted psychological element. The punishment could be inherited. If a noble died while serving a beast-eating sentence, their eldest son had to complete the remaining term. This created multi-generational shame, where entire family lines could be marked by the humiliation of their ancestors' eating punishments. The most documented case is Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who fled Russia rather than serve a beast-eating sentence, leaving his young son to inherit the punishment. Court records show that Kurbsky's son spent 7 years eating on the floor like an animal, a daily reminder of his father's alleged betrayal. Some rulers used eating punishments as political theater, designed to demonstrate their absolute power to other courtiers. Charles I of England perfected what he called public eating shame during the 1630s. When nobles violated court protocol, Charles would sentence them to eat their meals in the palace courtyard, visible to servants, visitors, and common people. The psychological impact of eating while being watched by social inferiors was considered one of the most humiliating experiences possible for aristocrats. English Civil War records describe how these public eating punishments contributed to the resentment that eventually led to Charles's execution. Nobles who'd been forced to eat in public view became some of his most bitter enemies, feeling that he had stripped them of their fundamental dignity. But the strangest aspect of these eating punishments was how they sometimes backfired. Some nobles developed a perverse pride in their ability to endure humiliating dining restrictions. They turned their punishments into demonstrations of strength and resilience. The Earl of Essex, sentenced to 3 years of standing meals, actually developed a following among younger courtiers who admired his stoic endurance. He became more politically influential during his punishment than he had been before it, as nobles began to see him as a martyr to royal tyranny. And in some cases, the physical changes required by eating punishments actually improved the health of those sentenced. Nobles forced to eat standing up developed better posture and stronger leg muscles. Those restricted to their non-dominant hands became ambidextrous and mentally sharper. But these silver linings were rare exceptions. Most eating punishments achieved their goal of breaking the spirit and political will of those who challenged royal authority. They served as constant daily reminders that even the most basic human activities could be controlled and manipulated by those in power. Yet even these elaborate punishment systems couldn't protect monarchs from the greatest threat of all: the people closest to them, the ones who controlled their food before it ever reached the royal mouth. Because while kings were busy humiliating nobles with eating punishments, a select group of food tasters were quietly accumulating power that would eventually rival the monarchs themselves, building influence so vast that they could topple empires with a single strategic decision about what to taste and what to accidentally overlook. Here's the ultimate irony of royal power. The people hired to protect kings from poison often became more dangerous than any assassin ever could be, because while monarchs focused on grand political schemes and military campaigns, a small group of food tasters quietly built empires of influence that could make or break dynasties with a single strategic bite. Meet Locusta of Gaul, arguably the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. Despite never holding any official title, Locusta wasn't a queen or a senator. She was Nero's chief poison taster, and secretly his chief poison maker. Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius document how Locusta essentially controlled the imperial succession for over a decade through her unique position. Here's how she operated. As Nero's official taster, Locusta had legitimate access to all imperial food and complete knowledge of palace dining schedules. But what Nero didn't know was that Locusta was simultaneously working for multiple political factions, using her position to gather intelligence and coordinate assassinations. Roman court records preserved in the Vatican's secret archives show that Locusta was paid by at least 7 different noble families to provide information about Nero's eating habits, health, and psychological state. She knew when he was anxious, he ate more sweet foods. When he was planning military campaigns, he consumed more meat, and when he was politically vulnerable, he drank more wine. But Locusta's real power came from what she chose not to taste. In 68 AD, when a conspiracy formed against Nero, Locusta simply forgot to test his evening wine. She later claimed she'd been called away on urgent business, but the wine contained a slow-acting poison that contributed to Nero's deteriorating mental state in his final months. The brilliance of her strategy. If the poison killed Nero, she could claim she was protecting the empire from a mad emperor. If he survived, she could claim she had saved his life by detecting the poison. Either way, she emerged more powerful than before. When Nero died, Locusta immediately transferred her services to Emperor Galba. bringing with her detailed intelligence about Nero's former allies and enemies. She had essentially become the institutional memory of imperial power, more valuable to new rulers than any senator or general. But perhaps no taste tester accumulated more political influence than Ahmad ibn Tulun's personal food guardian, a man known only as al-Dawak, the taster, in 9th century Egypt. Historical records from the Abbasid period, housed in the British Museum, reveal that al-Dawak transformed his humble position into a shadow government that controlled much of medieval Egypt. Al-Dawak's innovation was recognizing that taste testing gave him unique access to private information. While officially sampling food, he was actually present during the most confidential discussions in the palace. Rulers spoke freely around their taste testers, treating them like furniture rather than people. Over 20 years of service, al-Dawak accumulated secrets about every major political figure in Egypt. He knew which governors were embezzling funds, which generals were planning rebellions, and which religious leaders were secretly opposing the caliphate. This information made him incredibly valuable to multiple power centers. Egyptian administrative records show that al-Dawak eventually controlled a network of over 40 informants throughout the region. Provincial governors would send him gifts and intelligence, treating him like a minister rather than a servant. Some historians argue that al-Dawak effectively ran Egypt's intelligence operations, while Ahmad ibn Tulun focused on military campaigns. The most remarkable aspect of al-Dawak's power: he never officially held any government position. He remained on paper just a taste tester. But his influence was so extensive that when Ahmad ibn Tulun died, several political factions approached al-Dawak to discuss who should become the next ruler. A taste tester was essentially choosing the next leader of Egypt. In medieval England, a taste tester named William de Courcy achieved something even more extraordinary. He became more trusted by the king than the king's own family. During the reign of Henry II, de Courcy parlayed his position into what was essentially a parallel court system. English royal records from the 12th century, preserved in the National Archives, describe how de Courcy established his own network of sub-tasters, people he trained to sample food in noble households throughout England. Officially, this was a food safety service. Unofficially, it was the most sophisticated intelligence network in medieval Europe. De Courcy's agents would visit noble estates, offering their services as professional food tasters. While sampling meals, they gathered information about political loyalties, military preparations, and family alliances. This intelligence was then reported back to de Courcy, who decided what to share with King Henry. The genius of this system was its apparent innocence. Nobles welcomed professional tasters as a luxury service, never realizing they were essentially inviting government spies to their dinner tables. De Courcy's network grew so extensive that he possessed intelligence about virtually every major noble family in England. Henry II became so dependent on de Courcy's information that he consulted him before making major political decisions. Court chroniclers noted that the king would often delay important meetings until he could speak with William about the appetites of the realm, a coded reference to de Courcy's intelligence briefings. But the most shocking example of taste tester power comes from 16th century Ottoman Turkey, where a man named Mehmet the Taster essentially controlled the succession to the Ottoman throne for over 30 years. Ottoman palace records, preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives, reveal that Mehmet served as chief taster for 3 consecutive sultans: Bayezid Sekud, Selim the Pierre, and Suleiman the Magnificent. What made him unique was his ability to influence each sultan's health and longevity through selective food management. Here's how Mehmet operated. he would gradually introduce subtle dietary changes that either strengthened or weakened the sultan's constitution over time. For sultans he favored, he would ensure they received optimal nutrition and secretly supplement their diets with health-promoting substances. For sultans he wanted to weaken, he would allow small amounts of harmful substances to pass through his testing, claiming they were safe in minimal quantities. Turkish court physicians' notes describe how Mehmet's recommendations shaped imperial health policy. He convinced Bayezid III to avoid certain foods that were actually beneficial, weakening the elderly sultan's health. He then helped Selim I maintain peak physical condition during his rise to power. Finally, he ensured Suleiman received a diet that supported his legendary longevity and military prowess. The most incredible aspect: Mehmet was simultaneously advising rival princes about their father's health, essentially playing all sides in succession disputes. He would tell Prince Selim exactly when his father Bayezid was weakening, giving Selim strategic advantages in their political struggle. Later, he provided similar intelligence to Suleiman about Selim's condition. By the time of Suleiman's reign, Mehmet had become so powerful that he was consulted on military strategy and diplomatic decisions. Ottoman records show that foreign ambassadors would sometimes request private meetings with the Sultan's food master, recognizing his influence over imperial policy. But power corrupts, and some taste testers began using their positions for personal enrichment rather than political influence. In 17th-century France, a taste tester named François Vatel, not to be confused with the famous chef, created what was essentially the first recorded case of food-based insider trading. Vatel realized that his advanced knowledge of royal dining preferences could be monetarily valuable. If he knew the king was planning to serve specific wines at upcoming state dinners, he could invest in those wine producers before their prices rose. If the royal family decided to avoid certain foods for health reasons, he could short-sell related agricultural commodities. French financial records from the period, discovered in the Archives Nationales, show that Vatel accumulated wealth equivalent to several $1 million in today's currency. Through his food-based investment strategies, he became so wealthy that he eventually owned vineyards, grain mills, and livestock farms, making him one of the richest men in France despite his humble official position. But Vatel's success was his downfall. Other courtiers noticed his unexplained wealth and began investigating his activities. When Louis XIV learned that his taste tester had been profiting from inside information about royal food preferences, he was furious, not because of the financial impropriety, but because it suggested Vatel had been paying more attention to market opportunities than to potential poisons. Vatel was executed in 1691, but his influence lived on. His investment strategies were secretly copied by other palace insiders, creating an underground economy of food-based intelligence trading that persisted for decades. The ultimate irony of these powerful taste testers was that many of them lived longer and more comfortably than the monarchs they served. While kings died from stress, assassination, or poor health decisions, the taste testers, with their detailed knowledge of nutrition, toxicology, and palace politics, often outlived multiple rulers and accumulated enough wealth and influence to establish their own dynasties. But even the most powerful taste testers couldn't control every aspect of royal dining, because there was one category of meals that operated by completely different rules, where even the most experienced food guardians were powerless to prevent disaster: royal wedding feasts. These celebrations, meant to symbolize joy and unity, became some of the deadliest events in royal history, where ancient traditions and superstitions created opportunities for tragedy that would shock even the most paranoid monarchs. Nothing should be more joyful than a royal wedding feast, Two kingdoms uniting, families celebrating, the promise of new alliances sealed with elaborate banquets. But throughout history, royal wedding dining traditions became some of the deadliest rituals ever created, where ancient customs designed to ensure fertility and prosperity instead delivered death, madness, and the collapse of entire dynasties. The very phrase, honeymoon, comes from a medieval tradition so dangerous that it killed more royal brides than battlefield injuries killed their husbands. In ancient Germanic and Celtic cultures, newlywed royal couples were required to drink mead, fermented honey wine, for an entire lunar month after their wedding. This wasn't just celebration. It was believed to ensure fertility and divine blessing on the union. But here's the deadly catch. The mead had to be prepared using sacred honey, collected from specific locations that were often contaminated with toxic plants. Bees that fed on oleander, rhododendron, or certain wildflowers produced honey containing powerful neurotoxins. What was meant to be a month of romantic celebration became a month-long poisoning ritual. Medieval chronicles document numerous cases of royal brides who died during their honeymoon period. Not from violence or disease, but from slow toxic poisoning disguised as wedding tradition. The most documented case is that of Princess Gisela of Bavaria, who married Prince Conrad of Burgundy in 987 AD. Bavarian court records, preserved in the Munich State Archives, describe how Gisela began showing symptoms of neurological damage just 2 weeks into her honeymoon. She experienced tremors, confusion, and difficulty speaking. All classic signs of honey-based neurotoxin poisoning. Court physicians, not understanding the connection to the mead, attributed her condition to wedding spirits and prescribed more honey-based remedies, accelerating her decline. Gisela died on the 28th day of her honeymoon, just 3 days before the traditional month-long period would have ended. Conrad, devastated and convinced that supernatural forces opposed their union, refused to remarry. The alliance between Bavaria and Burgundy collapsed, leading to decades of territorial conflicts that reshaped medieval European borders. But contaminated honey was just one of many lethal wedding food traditions. Byzantine royal weddings featured a ritual called the unity bread, a special loaf that both bride and groom had to eat from simultaneously to symbolize their joined lives. The bread was prepared using ancient recipes that included ingredients believed to have mystical properties, certain mushrooms for spiritual connection, rare spices for passionate love, and herbs for eternal binding. What Byzantine bakers didn't understand was that many of these sacred ingredients were psychoactive or toxic when consumed in the quantities required by tradition. The wedding of Emperor Constantine II and Helena Lecapenos in 919 AD nearly ended in disaster because of unity bread. Byzantine court historians describe how both bride and groom began hallucinating during their wedding feast, seeing visions and speaking incoherently. Guests initially thought this was divine inspiration, but when the hallucinations continued for 3 days, court physicians realized something was wrong. Analysis of the wedding bread recipe preserved in Byzantine monastery records reveals it contains significant quantities of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces compounds similar to LSD. The royal couple had essentially been given a massive hallucinogenic dose during their most important state ceremony. The political consequences were severe. Constantine spent weeks in a confused, paranoid state, making erratic decisions that destabilized the empire. Helena developed what we would now recognize as PTSD from the traumatic hallucinations, refusing to participate in court life for months. Their marriage never recovered from this drug-induced wedding disaster. Celtic royal wedding traditions included perhaps the most psychologically cruel food ritual ever created: the binding feast. Both families would prepare dishes using ingredients that represented their respective kingdoms: grains from their lands, herbs from their forests, salt from their seas. But here's the twist: if the marriage later failed, or if political alliances broke down, both families were required to eat the separation meal, the same foods they had shared during the wedding, but now deliberately spoiled or mixed with bitter substances. This meal was meant to undo the spiritual bonds created during the wedding feast. Irish medieval chronicles describe the case of King Dermot MacMurrough, whose political marriage to Dervagilla of Meath failed when she eloped with another man in 1152. Both the MacMurrough and Meath families were required to participate in a separation meal, consuming rancid versions of their wedding foods. The ritual was so psychologically traumatic, forcing families to literally taste the bitterness of broken alliances, that it often led to permanent hostility between kingdoms. The MacMurrough-Meath conflict, triggered partly by this food ritual, eventually contributed to the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169. Chinese imperial wedding traditions included the Five Harmonies banquet, where specific foods representing the five elements had to be consumed in precise order by the bride and groom: wood, vegetables, fire, spicy foods, earth, grains, metal, white foods, and water, liquids. Each had to be eaten while reciting specific vows. The Chinese court records from the Ming dynasty reveal that this tradition became a tool for political assassination. In 1435, the wedding of Prince Zhu Gaoxiu included a Five Harmonies banquet where the metal course, traditionally white rice cakes, had been prepared with arsenic-based white pigments to achieve the required pure white color. Both the prince and his bride became violently ill during the ceremony. The prince survived, but his bride died 3 days later. Investigation revealed that the arsenic poisoning was deliberate. Rival court factions had used the wedding food tradition as cover for an assassination attempt. The scandal was so severe that Emperor Xuande banned all colored foods from imperial weddings, but the damage was done. Prince Zhu Gaoxiu became so paranoid about food that he refused to participate in most court ceremonies, effectively removing himself from the succession line. European royal weddings developed increasingly elaborate food rituals that often backfired spectacularly. The tradition of wedding wine fountains, ornate structures that dispensed wine for all guests, seemed magnificent, but created perfect opportunities for mass poisoning. The wedding of Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy to Margaret of York in 1468 featured the most elaborate wine fountain ever constructed. Bruges city records, preserved in the Belgian state archives, describe a mechanical marvel with multiple tiers dispensing different types of wine to demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of the Burgundian court. But the fountain's complexity made it impossible to monitor for tempering. During the celebration, someone added a purgative herb to one of the wine reservoirs. Over 200 wedding guests became violently ill, including several foreign ambassadors who interpreted the mass sickness as a deliberate insult to their kingdoms. The diplomatic fallout was severe. 3 allied kingdoms withdrew their support for Burgundy, convinced that Duke Charles had deliberately poisoned foreign dignitaries. The incident contributed to the isolation that eventually led to Charles's death in battle, and the absorption of Burgundy into France. Perhaps the most tragic wedding food disaster occurred during the marriage of Tsarevich Dmitry of Russia to Maria Nagaya in 1582. Russian Orthodox wedding traditions required the bride and groom to share blessed bread that had been prepared by monks and sanctified through specific prayers. But the bread preparation process documented in Russian monastery records included ingredients that were toxic when combined. Blessed poppy seeds, containing opiates, sacred mushrooms, containing psychoactive compounds, and holy oils, containing lead-based preservatives, created a cocktail of substances that was literally poisonous. Both Dmitri and Maria became ill during their wedding ceremony. Maria miscarried their first child due to the toxic exposure, and Dmitri developed neurological problems that affected his ability to rule. When Dmitri died under mysterious circumstances 7 years later, many historians now believe the wedding food poisoning contributed to his declining health and eventual death. The death of Dmitri created a succession crisis that led to the Time of Troubles, a period of political chaos that nearly destroyed the Russian state. A wedding food tradition meant to bless a royal marriage instead helped trigger one of the most catastrophic periods in Russian history. But these wedding food disasters pale in comparison to what was happening behind the scenes, the kitchens where these meals were prepared, because the royal kitchens themselves were perhaps the most dangerous places in any palace. Not just because of the poisons and accidents, but because of the human dramas, political conspiracies, and deadly rivalries that made these food preparation areas more treacherous than any battlefield. The secrets hidden in royal kitchens were darker than the deepest dungeon cells. Step into the royal kitchen, and you'd think you were entering the heart of luxury and abundance. Golden utensils, marble countertops, the finest ingredients from across the known world. But beneath this gleaming surface lay secrets so dark, conspiracies so twisted, that these kitchens became the most dangerous rooms in any palace. Places where more blood was spilled than in any dungeon, and where death came disguised as dinner preparation. The kitchen staff knew everything. Think about it. They handled every piece of food before it reached royal lips. They overheard conversations during meal preparation. They knew the personal habits and health conditions of every royal family member. This made them incredibly valuable as informants and incredibly dangerous as enemies. Consider the case of Master Chef Guillaume Tirel, known as Taillevent, who served the French royal court from 1326 to 1395. For nearly 70 years, Taillevent was the most trusted person in the French royal kitchen, preparing meals for 4 different kings. But documents discovered in the French National Archives in 1987 reveal that Taillevent was simultaneously working as a spy for English intelligence throughout most of his career. Here's how his operation worked. Taillevent would encode military and political intelligence into his grocery orders. When he requested 12 pounds of English salt, it meant 12 English ships had been spotted near French ports. Orders for Spanish saffron indicated Spanish troop movements. Italian olive oil meant Italian diplomatic correspondence had been intercepted. The English paid Taillevent through a network of foreign spice merchants who would deliberately overcharge the French court for ingredients, with the excess money going directly to Taillevent. Over his 7-decade career, French records show that Taillevent accumulated wealth, equivalent to several modern fortunes while appearing to be just a loyal royal chef. But Taillevent's most devastating act of espionage came in 1356. Just before the Battle of Poitiers. He deliberately delayed a crucial feast honoring French military commanders, causing them to be late for their final strategic meeting. This timing disruption contributed to the poor coordination that led to France's catastrophic defeat and the capture of King John II. An English chef had essentially helped determine the outcome of one of the most important battles of the 100 Years' War, all while appearing to simply prepare dinner. But Taillevent was just one player in a much larger game. Royal kitchens became centers of international espionage because they offered perfect cover for intelligence operations. Foreign agents could pose as specialty cooks, spice merchants, or exotic ingredient suppliers, gaining access to the most sensitive areas of palaces while appearing to provide luxury services. The Ottoman palace kitchens developed perhaps the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation in response to this threat. Sultan Mehmed II created what Ottoman records call the Kitchen Guard, a secret police force that monitored all kitchen staff for signs of espionage or disloyalty. Turkish palace archives from the 15th century describe how this kitchen guard operated with ruthless efficiency. They planted false information to test staff loyalty, monitored personal relationships between kitchen workers, and conducted regular loyalty purges where suspected traitors were eliminated. The most chilling aspect: the kitchen guard used the kitchen's own equipment and processes to dispose of enemies. Bodies were processed using meat grinding equipment, dissolved in large cooking vats filled with acid-based cleaning solutions, or burned in the massive ovens used for palace bread production. Ottoman court physician records, preserved in the Topkapi Palace Library, document that over 400 kitchen staff disappeared during Mehmed's reign. Officially, they had been transferred to other duties or had returned to their home provinces. In reality, they had been murdered by the kitchen guard and their bodies completely eliminated using kitchen infrastructure. But the kitchens weren't just sites of espionage. They were also scenes of incredibly brutal internal politics. The competition for positions in royal kitchens was so intense that murder became a common career advancement strategy. Take the case of the Medici palace kitchens in 15th century Florence. Italian court records describe a 20-year period where the position of head chef changed hands 14 times, not because of normal turnover, but because of a series of kitchen accidents that were actually carefully planned assassinations. The most documented case involved Chef Antonio Di Marco, who in 1478 eliminated his rival, Chef Giuseppe Vanucci, by staging an elaborate accident with boiling oil. Florentine judicial records show that Di Marco deliberately loosened the supports on a large cauldron of oil, timing its collapse to occur when Vanucci was working directly underneath. Vanucci died instantly from the scalding oil, and Di Marco was immediately promoted to head chef. But what makes this case remarkable is that Florentine investigators later discovered that Di Marco had used this same method to eliminate 2 previous rivals over the course of 5 years. The Medici family knew about these murders but chose to ignore them, because Di Marco was an exceptional chef whose culinary skills enhanced their political reputation. They essentially allowed a serial killer to operate in their kitchen because his risotto was so delicious it impressed foreign ambassadors. Chinese imperial kitchens developed their own unique forms of internal violence. During the Ming Dynasty, kitchen staff were organized into competing cooking schools that represented different regional culinary traditions. These schools engaged in what historical records describe as flavor wars, conflicts where sabotaging rival schools' dishes became a form of professional combat. Chinese court records from the 16th century document incidents where kitchen staff would contaminate competitors' ingredients with substances that would ruin taste without causing obvious poisoning. Salt might be replaced with bitter minerals, sugar with substances that caused intense stomach pain, or spices with compounds that caused temporary paralysis of taste buds. But these flavor wars escalated into real violence. In 1547, a conflict between Cantonese and Sichuan cooking schools in the imperial kitchen led to what court chroniclers called the Night of Sharp Knives. Kitchen staff armed themselves with cooking utensils and fought a pitched battle that left 7 dead and 23 injured. The emperor, rather than punishing the survivors, was reportedly impressed by their passion for culinary excellence. and instituted formal competitions between cooking schools to channel their competitive energy more constructively. European royal kitchens faced a different but equally dangerous problem: the tradition of kitchen trials, where suspected food poisoners were subjected to brutal interrogations conducted in the very rooms where they had allegedly committed their crimes. English court records from the 16th century describe how suspected poisoners would be chained to kitchen work tables and tortured using cooking implements. Red-hot ladles were pressed against skin, boiling water was used for forced confessions, and sharp kitchen knives became instruments of interrogation. The psychological impact was intentional. Suspects were tortured in the same place where they had prepared royal meals, surrounded by the tools they had used for their alleged crimes. Many confessed to poisoning attempts they had never committed simply to end the agony of these kitchen trials. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of royal kitchen culture was the practice of testing loyalty through forced participation in violence. New kitchen staff were sometimes required to prove their commitment by participating in the elimination of suspected traitors. French royal records describe how potential kitchen employees would be given a choice: help dispose of a proven traitor or be barred from royal service forever. This created a cycle where kitchen staff became complicit in murder as a condition of employment, ensuring their silence through shared guilt. The most documented case involves the kitchen of King Francis I, where new employees were required to participate in what was euphemistically called cleaning duties, that actually involved dismembering the bodies of executed kitchen staff and disposing of remains using kitchen equipment. This practice served multiple purposes. It eliminated evidence of executions, terrorized kitchen staff into absolute loyalty, and created a workforce that was too compromised to ever reveal royal secrets. The death toll in royal kitchens was so high that many palaces maintained what were essentially kitchen graveyards, unmarked burial sites for kitchen staff who had died under suspicious circumstances. Archaeological excavations at several European palace sites have uncovered evidence of these hidden cemeteries, containing remains showing signs of violent death. But even the deadliest kitchen conspiracies were just preparation for the ultimate evolution of royal food culture. When monarchs stopped using food defensively and began wielding it as an offensive weapon. Because the stories we're about to explore reveal how food became the ultimate instrument of warfare, capable of destroying entire populations without firing a single arrow or drawing a single sword. Forget everything you know about medieval warfare. Forget swords, arrows, and siege engines. The most devastating weapon ever wielded by royalty was something far more insidious, far more terrifying, and far more effective than any army: the deliberate control and manipulation of food itself. When monarchs stopped thinking of food as sustenance and started seeing it as a weapon of mass destruction, they unleashed horrors that make modern warfare seem almost humane. Let's begin with perhaps the most chilling example: the Great Irish Famine of 1315 to 1320, which wasn't entirely caused by bad weather as history books often suggest. English royal records discovered in the National Archives in 1994 reveal that King Edward II deliberately exacerbated the famine as a weapon against Scottish allies in Ireland. Here's how Edward's food warfare operated. When crop failures began in 1315, instead of allowing English grain surpluses to be shipped to Ireland, Edward issued secret orders requiring all available food to be stockpiled in English fortresses. Irish ports were blockaded under the pretense of preventing Scottish smuggling. But the real purpose was to ensure that no food relief could reach the starving population. The strategy was diabolically effective. English administrative records show that Edward's government deliberately purchased grain from European markets, not to feed the Irish, but to prevent other powers from providing humanitarian aid. They essentially cornered the market on famine relief, then refused to distribute it. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary chronicles suggest that over 300,000 Irish people died from starvation and related diseases. But Edward achieved his strategic goal. Irish support for Scottish independence collapsed as local lords focused on survival rather than rebellion. An entire population was sacrificed to prevent political alliance. But Edward's Irish famine strategy was inspired by an even more sophisticated food warfare operation. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's siege of Milan in 1162. What made this siege revolutionary wasn't the military tactics. It was Frederick's understanding that controlling food distribution could be more effective than direct military assault. Frederick didn't just surround Milan with armies. He implemented what German military chronicles call the hunger strategy, a systematic campaign to destroy not just current food supplies, but the long-term agricultural capacity of the entire Milanese region. Holy Roman Empire records detail how Frederick's forces salted agricultural fields to prevent future planting, poisoned wells with animal carcasses, and deliberately spread livestock diseases to eliminate protein sources. But the most insidious aspect was psychological. Frederick would allow small amounts of food to reach the city, just enough to prevent immediate mass death, but not enough to prevent suffering. This created a climate of false hope followed by despair that broke Milanese morale far more effectively than starvation alone could have. People would see food deliveries and believe relief was coming, only to realize the quantities were deliberately insufficient. The psychological torture of almost enough food proved more demoralizing than complete blockade. Milan surrendered after 18 months, not because the city was militarily defeated, but because the population had been psychologically broken by food manipulation. Frederick had proven that controlling hope and despair through food distribution was the ultimate weapon of conquest. But perhaps no ruler perfected food warfare more completely than Stalin. Wait, that's too modern. Let me tell you about a medieval master, King John of England, who pioneered techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. During John's conflict with rebellious barons in 1215–1216, he implemented what English chroniclers called the locust strategy. John's forces would systematically destroy food sources in rebel territories, not just seizing supplies, but ensuring they couldn't be used by anyone. Royal wardrobe accounts from 1216, preserved in the British Library, detail payments for teams of specialists whose only job was food destruction. Grain was burned, but first it was mixed with lime to ensure it couldn't be salvaged even partially. Livestock was slaughtered, but the meat was deliberately spoiled with toxic substances to prevent consumption. Wells were poisoned with a mixture specifically designed to cause prolonged illness rather than immediate death. The genius of John's strategy was its long-term impact. Even after military conflicts ended, affected regions couldn't immediately return to normal food production. Agricultural recovery took years, keeping formerly rebellious populations dependent on royal food distribution for survival. John essentially created a system where rebellion meant not just immediate military consequences, but long-term starvation that could affect entire communities for generations. The threat of food warfare became more effective than actual battles in preventing future uprisings. The Byzantine Empire developed perhaps the most sophisticated food warfare tactics in history. During conflicts with Arab forces in the 8th and 9th centuries, Byzantine military manuals describe strategies that sound like something from a modern bio-warfare handbook. Byzantine forces would introduce diseased livestock into enemy territory, timing the spread of animal diseases to coincide with peak agricultural seasons. They developed techniques for contaminating grain supplies with fungal infections that would cause gradual poisoning over months rather than immediate death. But their most innovative tactic was water warfare. Byzantine engineers became experts at redirecting rivers and contaminating water sources in ways that would devastate enemy agriculture, without obviously appearing to be military actions. They could cause droughts or floods that seemed natural, but were actually carefully engineered military operations. The most documented example occurred during the siege of Damascus in 796 AD. Byzantine forces secretly diverted mountain streams that fed the city's agricultural region, causing what appeared to be a natural drought. Simultaneously, they introduced salt water into remaining fresh water sources, making them unsuitable for irrigation. Damascus experienced agricultural collapse that seemed like divine punishment rather than military action. The psychological impact was devastating. People believed they were being punished by God for resisting the Byzantine Empire, rather than understanding they were victims of military engineering. Chinese military strategists took food warfare in a completely different direction, developing techniques for turning abundance into weapon. During the Song dynasty, military treatises describe the golden poisoning, strategies for introducing luxurious but addictive or harmful foods into enemy territories. The concept was brilliantly manipulative. Instead of creating scarcity, Chinese forces would flood enemy regions with exotic, delicious foods that contained subtle addictive properties or long-term health consequences. Enemy populations would develop dependencies on these gifts, making them easier to control or weaken over time. Song dynasty military records describe successful campaigns where enemy armies were gradually weakened not through starvation, but through deliberate overconsumption of specially prepared foods that reduced physical fitness and mental alertness over months of consumption. But the most terrifying food warfare strategy was developed by the Mongol Empire: the complete elimination of agricultural knowledge. When Mongol forces conquered regions, they didn't just destroy crops. They systematically eliminated the people who understood local agricultural techniques. Mongol military accounts describe how they would specifically target farmers, irrigation specialists, and anyone with agricultural expertise for execution or deportation. The goal wasn't just to create immediate famine, but to ensure that conquered regions could never again achieve agricultural independence. Persian historical chronicles document how former agricultural centers in Central Asia became permanent wastelands not because the land was unusable, but because the knowledge of how to farm it effectively had been systematically destroyed. The Mongols had weaponized ignorance itself. The psychological impact of food warfare often exceeded its immediate military value. Populations that survived these campaigns developed deep trauma around food security that lasted for generations. Children who grew up during food warfare campaigns became adults with pathological food hoarding behaviors and extreme anxiety around agricultural seasons. Medieval medical texts describe what we would now recognize as PTSD symptoms, specifically related to food warfare: nightmares about starvation, compulsive food stockpiling, and an inability to enjoy meals even when food was abundant. Entire cultures developed around the expectation of food-based warfare, changing cooking techniques, storage methods, and even religious practices to prepare for anticipated attacks on their food supply. But these large-scale food warfare strategies were just the foundation for something even more sinister. Because while rulers were learning to starve entire populations, they are also discovering that the most effective food-based attacks weren't aimed at enemies, but at their own people. The royal food rules that persist to this day reveal how deeply these ancient food warfare techniques became embedded in the very structure of monarchical power. You might think that in our modern world of democracy and social media, these bizarre royal food rules would have disappeared into the dustbin of history. You'd be wrong. Dead wrong. Not only do many of these ancient dining restrictions still exist today, but some have evolved into forms so subtle and sophisticated that most people have no idea they're witnessing the continuation of medieval food warfare tactics every time they see a modern royal family at dinner. Let's start with the most shocking revelation. Queen Elizabeth II, who ruled for over 70 years, never once ate garlic in public. Not once. And this wasn't a personal preference. It was a continuation of the same peasant food prohibition that killed medieval kings during plague outbreaks. Buckingham Palace Protocol, documented in staff manuals leaked to the press in 2008, explicitly states that garlic is forbidden from all royal meals because it's considered inappropriate for public engagements. The reasoning? Royal family members must never risk having breath that could offend foreign dignitaries or the public during official events. But here's the deeper truth. This garlic ban is actually a modern evolution of the ancient belief that royal blood requires different food than common blood. Former royal chef Darren McGrady, who worked for the Queen for 15 years, revealed in his memoir that the garlic prohibition extended to all members of the immediate royal family at all times, even private meals in their personal residences. Think about that. In the 21st century, some of the most powerful people in the world were still following food restrictions created by medieval fears of appearing too common. The Queen lived her entire adult life without experiencing one of humanity's most fundamental flavors because of rules designed to maintain social hierarchy through dietary separation. But the garlic ban is just the tip of the iceberg. Modern royal dining protocols maintain dozens of restrictions that directly descend from the medieval rules we've been exploring. Royal family members still cannot eat shellfish during official visits. Not because of allergies, but because of ancient fears about food poisoning during diplomatic events. The rule originated from the same paranoia that created medieval taste tester systems. Shellfish spoil quickly and can cause dramatic, embarrassing illness. Modern royal protocol maintains that the risk of a royal family member becoming visibly ill during a state dinner is too great to allow shellfish consumption, even with modern refrigeration and food safety standards. Former Royal Protection Officer Ken Worf revealed that this extends to dozens of other foods considered diplomatically risky. No rare meat, ancient poison fears, no exotic fruits from gift baskets, potential allergen concerns rooted in medieval suspicions of foreign food, and no tap water in foreign countries, directly descended from medieval well-poisoning paranoia. The psychological impact on modern royals mirrors what we saw in historical accounts. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, developed what staff described as obsessive food control behaviors that echo the ancient patterns of royal eating disorders. Royal biographers have documented how Charles requires his meals to be prepared according to incredibly specific protocols: eggs boiled for exactly 4 minutes, toast cut into precise triangular pieces, tea served at specific temperatures measured with thermometers. These aren't simple preferences. They're manifestations of the same need for absolute control over food that drove medieval monarchs to create elaborate tasting ceremonies. The most disturbing modern evolution of ancient royal food rules involves what palace insiders called the visibility protocol. Current royal family members are trained from childhood never to show genuine emotional reactions to food, maintaining the same dining face that medieval monarchs developed. Watch any video of modern royals eating at public events. Notice how they never express surprise, delight, or disgust at any food they're served. This isn't natural behavior. It's the result of intensive training that teaches them to maintain neutral expressions regardless of what they're eating. Just like their medieval predecessors, Princess Diana broke these rules regularly, and royal staff considered it scandalous. She would visibly enjoy food, laugh during meals, and express genuine preferences. Palace protocol officers, according to Diana's former bodyguard Ken Worth, considered her natural eating behavior to be undignified and a threat to royal mystique. But the most shocking modern continuation of medieval royal food culture is the persistence of social eating hierarchy. Current royal protocols still dictate that family members must eat in specific orders based on their position in the line of succession. At formal family dinners, the monarch eats first, followed by direct heirs, then other family members in precise order of royal precedence. No one can begin eating until the highest-ranking person starts, and everyone must stop eating when the monarch finishes, exactly like medieval court protocols. This means that junior royal family members might go hungry at formal dinners if the monarch eats quickly or has a small appetite. It's a continuation of the same power dynamics that once forced medieval courtiers to endure elaborate dining performances while their own nutritional needs were ignored. The modern royal protection system maintains elements of medieval taste testing, though they've evolved it into something more sophisticated. Royal food is still tested, but now it's done through chemical analysis rather than human tasters. However, the psychological principle remains identical. The assumption that royal food requires additional safety measures that common people's food doesn't need. Former MI5 protection officer David Rankin Hunt revealed that royal meals undergo screening processes that would shock most people. Every ingredient is traced to its source, every preparation step is monitored, and every person involved in food handling undergoes extensive background checks. The modern royal dining experience maintains the same atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that characterized medieval royal feasts. But perhaps the most remarkable modern evolution of royal food rules is how they've influenced contemporary celebrity culture. The elaborate food restrictions, dietary protocols, and eating performances that we see in Hollywood and social media are direct descendants of royal dining theater. When celebrities hire food tasters, maintain elaborate dietary restrictions, or perform their eating habits for public consumption, they're essentially creating modern versions of royal food culture. The Instagram food post, the carefully curated restaurant visit, the elaborate dietary restriction. These are all echoes of medieval royal dining performance. The psychological toll remains consistent across centuries. Modern royals, like their medieval predecessors, often develop complicated relationships with food that reflect their complicated relationships with power and public performance. They must constantly balance human needs with symbolic requirements, personal preferences with political necessities, and the most disturbing aspect, these food rules are becoming more elaborate, not less. As global media attention intensifies, royal families have developed even more sophisticated food protocols to manage their public image. Modern technology has actually enabled more detailed food control than medieval monarchs could ever have imagined. Current royal protection protocols include GPS tracking of all food sources, real-time chemical monitoring of meal preparation, and comprehensive digital documentation of every food-related decision. Medieval kings might have envied the level of food control that modern royals maintain, even as they suffer from the same psychological consequences of treating eating as political performance, rather than human necessity. But all of these modern food rules, all of this continuing paranoia and control, pale in comparison to what we're about to explore in our final chapter. Because the ultimate lesson of royal food culture isn't about protocol or power. It's about the terrible price that absolute control over food ultimately demands. The stories of how royal gluttony, royal abstinence, and royal food obsession have literally killed the very monarchs they were meant to protect, reveal the final darkest truth about power and eating. And so we come to the ultimate irony of absolute power over food. The very control that monarchs fought so hard to maintain often became the instrument of their own destruction. Because when you have unlimited access to any food you desire, when no one can tell you no, when every meal becomes a demonstration of your infinite power, that's exactly when food becomes your deadliest enemy. Let's begin with the most famous case, Henry VIII of England, whose death was directly caused by the food culture he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Henry didn't just eat, he performed eating as an act of royal dominance. Contemporary accounts describe meals where Henry would consume quantities that sound almost fictional today. Venetian ambassador Sebastian Justinian, writing in 1519, documented a single dinner where Henry consumed a whole roasted swan, 6 capons, portions of venison, numerous sweet pastries, and enough wine to fill a small barrel. This wasn't celebration. This was a regular Tuesday night dinner. But here's what's truly shocking. Henry's gluttony wasn't just personal indulgence, it was political strategy. English court records show that Henry deliberately ate enormous quantities during diplomatic meetings to demonstrate England's abundance and his own unlimited power over resources. Foreign ambassadors were meant to be intimidated by watching the English king consume more food in one meal than their entire delegations would eat in a week. It was food as psychological warfare, designed to show that England was so wealthy that even its king could afford to waste vast quantities of luxury food. The strategy worked politically but destroyed Henry physically. By 1546, just 1 year before his death, Henry's physicians, led by Dr. Thomas Vicary, documented that the king weighed approximately 320 pounds and could barely walk without assistance. Court medical records preserved in the British Library describe Henry's final year as a nightmare of food-related medical complications. Henry developed what modern doctors would recognize as severe diabetes, gout, and cardiovascular disease, all directly related to decades of deliberate overeating performed as royal theatre. His leg ulcers, which contemporary accounts describe as putrid and foul-smelling, were caused by circulation problems resulting from extreme obesity. But the most tragic aspect, Henry couldn't stop. Even as his body was failing, royal protocol demanded that he continue performing regal abundance. His final meal, just hours before his death, included roasted meat, sweet wine, and sugared delicacies, foods that were literally poisonous to his diabetic system. Dr. Vicary's notes, discovered in 1890, reveal that Henry's medical team knew that his eating habits were killing him, but were too afraid to recommend dietary restrictions that might suggest the king's appetites needed to be controlled. Henry VII died because his own food culture made medical intervention politically impossible. But Henry's death pales in comparison to the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was killed not by how much he ate, but by his paranoid insistence on elaborate food safety protocols that created the perfect opportunity for his assassination. Claudius had survived multiple poison attempts by creating the most sophisticated taste testing system in Roman history. Every meal required approval from multiple tasters, and Claudius would often wait hours after his food was declared safe before eating it himself. Roman historian Tacitus documents how Claudius's wife Agrippina, exploited this very system to murder him in 54 AD. She convinced Claudius's most trusted taste tester, a woman named Locusta, to approve a dish of mushrooms that had been poisoned with a delayed action toxin. The poison was designed to take effect several hours after consumption, long after the taste testing was complete and Claudius felt safe to eat. The very safety system that Claudius had created to protect himself became the mechanism of his death. His paranoia about food safety created a vulnerability that his enemies exploited perfectly. But perhaps no ruler died more grotesquely from food excess than Emperor Vitellius, whose 8-month reign in 69 AD was essentially one long continuous feast that ended in his violent death during a food-induced stupor. Roman historian Suetonius provides detailed accounts of Vitellius's eating habits that sound like ancient versions of modern eating competitions. Vitellius would host 4 elaborate banquets every single day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a midnight feast. Each meal cost the equivalent of millions of modern dollars and featured exotic delicacies from across the Roman Empire. Suetonius documents one particularly infamous dinner, where Vitellius consumed a dish containing 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds, along with various other courses. The logistics of preparing such meals bankrupted the Roman treasury and required a staff of hundreds just to manage food preparation. But Vitellius's obsession with food created fatal political vulnerability. While he spent hours each day in dining rooms, consuming elaborate meals and planning even more extravagant feasts, Roman generals plotted against him. His enemies literally timed their rebellion, for when they knew Vitellius would be too intoxicated by food and wine to respond effectively. When Vespasian's forces entered Rome in December 69 AD, they found Vitellius in the middle of a midnight feast, so bloated and drunk that he couldn't escape or organize resistance. He was killed while still wearing his dining robes, surrounded by the remains of what Roman chroniclers called the most expensive meal in human history. The Chinese Tang dynasty provides perhaps the most poetic example of royal death by food excess. Emperor Xuanzong, who ruled for over 4 decades, developed an obsession with culinary perfection that ultimately consumed his empire and his life. Chinese court records from the 8th century describe how Xuanzong employed over 3,000 people just to manage his personal food requirements. He maintained separate kitchens for different seasons, different times of day, and different emotional states. Court chroniclers document that Xuanzong's food budget consumed nearly 30% of the imperial treasury. But Xuanzong's pursuit of perfect meals became an all-consuming passion that distracted him from governance. While he spent days planning elaborate dining experiences and perfecting recipes, the Anushan rebellion destroyed much of northern China. When rebels reached the capital, they found the emperor in his personal kitchen, working with chefs to develop a new sauce recipe. Xuanzong fled the capital but couldn't abandon his food obsessions even during the crisis. Chinese military records show that his baggage train included portable kitchens, refrigeration units, and teams of chefs, slowing his escape and making him an easy target for rebel forces. He died in exile, not from violence but from malnutrition, because his elaborate food requirements couldn't be maintained while fleeing for his life. The emperor, who had commanded the resources of the world's largest empire, died hungry because he had never learned to eat simple food. But the psychological pattern that killed these monarchs wasn't just gluttony. It was the fundamental inability to maintain human relationships with food. When food becomes a symbol of absolute power, every meal became a performance. Every bite became a political statement. Every dietary choice became a demonstration of royal authority. This transformation of eating from human necessity into political theater created profound psychological distortions. Rulers lost the ability to recognize hunger, satiation, or pleasure in any natural sense. They ate not because their bodies needed nourishment, but because their positions demanded constant demonstration of unlimited access to resources. The most tragic aspect is how this food power dynamic isolated monarchs from basic human experiences. They couldn't share simple meals with friends, couldn't enjoy casual snacks, couldn't even experience the basic pleasure of eating something delicious without it becoming a state occasion. Contemporary medical analysis of historical royal remains confirms what court physicians suspected. Many monarchs suffered from malnutrition despite having access to unlimited food. They consumed vast quantities of luxury items while lacking basic nutrients, because their diets were designed for political impact rather than biological needs. The lesson transcends history. When we transform basic human needs into displays of power, status, or control, whether royal banquets or modern social media food performance, we risk losing our connection to the simple human pleasure of nourishment shared with others. Food was meant to bring people together, to provide comfort and sustenance, to be one of life's simple pleasures. When it becomes a weapon, a status symbol, or a tool of control, it ultimately destroys those who wield it as surely as it destroys those who suffer from it. The bizarre food rules of royalty remind us that absolute power over anything, even something as basic as eating, comes with an ultimate price. And that price, as these stories show us, is often the very humanity that food was meant to nourish. And so our journey through the darkest kitchens and strangest dining rooms of history comes to an end. Thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring these incredible, disturbing, and sometimes darkly humorous stories of how power and food created some of the most bizarre chapters in human history. I hope these tales have given you a new perspective on the simple act of sharing a meal, and maybe made you grateful for the freedom to eat what you want, when you want, without having to worry about taste testers, political implications, or royal protocol. But history is filled with countless more stories waiting to be told, mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and secrets waiting to be whispered in the darkness. So until our paths cross again in another late-night journey through the hidden corridors of the past, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hiding in the most ordinary moments of human life.